Welcome, everybody, to our live webinar, 9/11, An Architect's Guide, a three-part series. Today's Thursday, December 17th, 2020. I'm Richard Gage, AIA, member of the American Institute of Architects and founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization representing a growing body of now more than 3,000 architects and engineers signed on to the petition demanding a new investigation into the destruction of all three World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11. Last week, we presented part 2 in this three-part series. That was the Twin Towers explosive destruction. This is part 3, the Twin Towers and extreme heat, in which we'll be looking at the evidence of very high temperatures and incendiary chemical reactions involved in the destruction of these two skyscrapers. First, let me introduce you to our operations manager and the host of 9/11 Freefall, Andy Steele. Hi, Andy.
Hi, Richard. Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in today. I just want to let everyone know that I'm here to help with any technical glitches which can occur from time to time. Also, we'll be happy to take your questions at the end of the webinar. You just submit them in the questions and information form online at ae911truth.org. Just go under Get Involved and select Continuing Education and the live webinars. You'll see the box right there. I'll also be looking at our Facebook broadcast of this webinar and on the YouTube broadcast for any good comments or questions related to the material that Richard will be presenting. So with all of that said, back to you, Richard.
And thanks, Andy. And just so people know something about my background, I was responsible at a local firm here in the San Francisco Bay Area for the construction documents for these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums. Where'd they go? Here they are. Let's see. Hold on one second. Speaking of technical glitches, they really do happen from time to time. And that was one of them. And here we go. There we go. And there we go. Ha! These $3 and $10 million gymnasiums and the construction administration for this $125 million high school. And more recently, before launching full-time into this important outreach effort, I had similar responsibilities working on this $400 million mixed-use project in Las Vegas, right near Las Vegas, with 6 blocks of retail, mid-rise office space, and parking structure, altogether about 1,200 tons of fireproofed steel framing. I now work full-time educating architects, engineers, and others to understand what really happened at the World Trade Center using the material in these courses. So, with regard to that, let's get right into it. We use the scientific method in the West for 100 years or so. We have a question. In this case, how did the Twin Towers collapse? The scientific method is used to winnow error from truth, fact from fiction, fantasy from reality, if you will. We try to get to the objective, downright truth outside of our own biases and so forth. So we have do some background research is what we do. We make observations. We construct a hypothesis. That's our best guess, really. All the hypotheses are laid out without respect to our own personal prejudices. For instance, in this case, maybe jet planes did bring the towers down. Maybe it was the ensuing fire or a combination of the two, as is the official story, the narrative provided by the government and media. Or maybe explosions, which we'll be looking at. We looked at last week quite extensively, and controlled demolition, perhaps even with incendiaries, which we'll be looking at today. These are all rational hypotheses, as I'm sure you'll agree after reviewing the evidence that we have for you today. We make predictions based on those hypotheses. We test them with experiments, analyze the results, draw conclusions. If the hypothesis is corroborated, we report the results in an open, transparent manner so all can build on the body of the work that we're doing. So if the hypothesis is not corroborated, what do? We go back, we construct a new hypothesis until we find one that is corroborated by the facts, and that allows us to come up with a hypothesis that is acceptable and reportable. So we're going to start that process today by going back and looking at the forces that destroy buildings. I mean, buildings do get destroyed. Here's one force. Fire certainly has brought down lots of buildings. Never before a steel frame skyscraper fireproofed, but say in a wood frame building, fire is an organic process. It moves chaotically through the building, burning out an area in 20 minutes. In modern skyscrapers, that's all the fuel there is to burn in a given area. It moves on looking for fresh new fuel sources. Now, interestingly, this is actually acknowledged by NIST in their report. Such fires did not persist in any one location for more than 20 or 30 minutes. This is critical because they're maintaining that these fires were burning in these buildings, particularly building 7, for like 4 or 5 hours, which we looked at in part 1 of this 3-part series. Building 7, the 3rd skyscraper to come down. If you didn't see part 1 or 2 in this series, you can see them for free on YouTube. Just look up 9/11 An Architect's Guide, the seminar or webinar. So now skyscrapers have not collapsed, but say in wood frame buildings, we'd expect, obeying the laws of entropy, if you will, chaos, increasing disintegration, the building would fall in stages. It would fall over, not straight down through the path of greatest resistance, the tons of intact, cold, hard structure below. But say in how would we expect in a steel frame fireproofed building? Well, they actually built one 8 stories tall to find out what would happen with severe fires in the buildings, and they set a fire on purpose with tons of kindling in there, really trying to get that fire at up to 2,000 degrees if they could. And let's see what happens. And some of these beams are fireproofed, and some of them are not, because they really wanted to test, how good the fireproofing is and what happens if you don't. Let's take a look.
This was the largest test of its kind ever conducted. It showed how unprotected steel can be distorted even by a normal office fire. But as is typical in steel buildings, the structural beams only slowly and progressively warped and sagged. There was no chance of a sudden collapse.
In over 20 years, I have not seen, until recently, a protected steel structure that has collapsed in a fire.
Until recently. He's referring here, of course, to 9/11, when we had not 2, but 3 protected steel structures collapse by fire. So this is a completely unprecedented event that should be the most studied in history, because it's completely unprecedented. After all, if these buildings came down, particularly building 7 that wasn't hit by an airplane, by normal office fires, which have never brought down a skyscraper, it has incredible ramifications for hundreds of similarly designed buildings around the world. So what happened here? The connections did not fail. They were the strongest. And it's the connections that are failing, according to NIST, in their analysis of the steel beams in building 7. And we'll get to the Twin Towers. But there's warpage that can occur. And as we can see in the middle, when it reaches its critical temperature, which we'll talk about in a moment. Well, let's look at some buildings that have collapsed due to natural causes. In this case, earthquakes. We have a building that's recognizable as such, a tall building. It's certainly damaged, but it's not. The columns and beams are not severed one from another. The concrete is not pulverized to a fine powder, as we'll see in the case of the Twin Towers, for instance. So this is extremely important. We have a history of natural collapses and what tall buildings look like. We recognize the building as a building, even though it's collapsed, for instance. It doesn't fall like a house of cards. Now, these buildings were blown up. We have thick, billowing, enormous pyroclastic-like clouds in cauliflower shaped, which are expanding rapidly due to the incredible heat from the hot gases from the ignition of these explosives. We have pulverized building materials that we see. We have witnesses that hear sounds of explosions. They see flashes of light. If you have these features, you know you have explosions. This is quite incredible, and we'll come back to that. We have explosions that can be harnessed quite effectively to bring down tall buildings. In this case, we call them controlled demolitions. We've all seen these in the old hotels in Las Vegas, for instance, where they set precisely timed shaped cutter charges against the columns and beams in the building, and then set them off in a very synchronized, deliberate pattern in order to achieve the result that they want to achieve. Often a straight down symmetrical collapse, but all kinds of ways to accomplish this. Now, there's only a handful of companies in the United States that can accomplish this, and fire never has. So it's not too difficult, in fact, to determine what damage fire causes versus what damage controlled demolition, because there's a typical set of features in these controlled demolitions. One is where they have a sudden onset of destruction through the path of greatest resistance. And this starts usually near the base of the structure. And as we'll see, it can start anywhere they want. There's a straight down symmetrical collapse into the building's footprint. And there's a patterned removal of column supports. That's how they achieve that symmetricality, resulting in a free fall or near free fall acceleration straight down through the thousands of tons of structural steel that was designed to hold up that building, which is 3 to 5 times stronger than it needs to be to do such. There's the total dismemberment of the structural steel system. And that's one of the goals. So you can load it easily on trucks and ship it away. There's limited damage to adjacent structures. That's certainly one of the goals of controlled demolition. There's patterned explosions heard by witnesses. There's flashes of light seen by them. There's broken up concrete floors. They don't want to have to go back and jackhammer those floors, resting at who knows what all odd angles and dangerous materials in the way. No, break up those floors so you can get that picked up easily by the grapplers. And there's explosive charges visible at many of these floors. These are called squibs in the controlled demolition industry. They're obviously explosions. We'll be looking at lots of those today. And then feature 10, of course, there's chemical evidence left behind in the residue. Now, if you have these features, you know you have direct evidence of destruction with explosives. Fire does not create these features, any of them, let alone all of them. Fires can cause less robust structures to collapse, but they do so asymmetrically with gradual deformation, following the path of least resistance, again, obeying the laws of entropy. So let's look at some fires, for instance, that have happened in certainly many dozen skyscrapers, but did they collapse?
May 4th, 1988, the First Interstate Bank, a 62-story building in Los Angeles, California, suffered a 3.5-hour fire which burned across 5 floors and caused an estimated $200 million of damage. It did not collapse. February 23rd, 1991, the One Meridian Plaza, a 38-story building in Philadelphia, suffered an 18-hour fire which burned across 8 floors. The fire caused an estimated $100 million worth of damage and 3 firefighters died fighting it. It was later described by officials as the most significant fire of the century. It did not collapse. October 17, 2004, the East Tower of the Park Central complex in Caracas, Venezuela, suffered a 17-hour fire which spread across 26 of its 56 floors. It did not collapse. August 18, 2007, a fire broke out on the 17th floor of the Deutsche Bank building in New York, a building undergoing deconstruction after being heavily damaged by debris from the South Tower on 9/11. Originally 41 stories in height, it had been reduced to 26 at the time of the fire, which lasted 7 hours and affected a total of 10 floors. 2 firefighters died of smoke inhalation. It did not collapse. On 9/11 itself, 5 World Trade Center, a 9-story building east of the North Tower, was engulfed in flames after sustaining heavy damage from falling debris. A number of partial collapses occurred, but the overall structure remained standing. February 9, 2009, the Mandarin Oriental Hotel in Beijing was completely engulfed in flames for more than 3 hours during the Lunar New Year celebrations. The fire affected all 44 floors, igniting fireworks as it burned. 1 firefighter died fighting it. It did not collapse.
No, they didn't. Not even World Trade Center 5, the largest fire and the longest lasting actually in the World Trade Center. Tall buildings and mid-rise buildings that are fireproof, steel frame skyscrapers don't collapse. Not even after 9/11, where we have these fully engulfed buildings, no collapse. So, and yet we're told that the Twin Towers collapsed due to these fires, which were quite diminished at the time of the collapse and indicated by the thick black smoke. They're oxygen-starved and cooler fires. Well, why doesn't this happen in steel frame buildings? This is important. We have the steel itself, even when not fireproofed, conducting that heat away from the source. So it never reaches its 1200 degree Fahrenheit temperature, at which steel can lose half of its strength and begin to sag and warp. Well, we also, just to keep that from ever happening, we fireproof the steel with cementitious fireproofing. We just spray it on. 2 and 3 hour fire protection, 4 to 6 times more fire protection than we need, because remember, even as acknowledged by NIST, the fires don't last more than 20 or 30 minutes. Also, we keep the tenants from bringing in combustible fuel loads, like huge amounts of paper and so forth. They only have desks and chairs, and we build these buildings out of inflammable materials. So all that helps, and just to keep any fire from ever becoming a problem, we sprinkler these buildings with automatic fire sprinklers, and that puts the fire out before it ever becomes a problem. So this is why we don't have problems in skyscrapers. With additional circumstantial corroborative documentation, like evidence, like government documentation, you don't just bring a building down to the ground without a whole set of approvals. It takes months and advanced planning and engineering, so people know in advance that there's going to be a controlled demolition. Experts agree after seeing it, yeah, that's a controlled demolition. Well, at least those experts without financial or political biases that could sway their objective opinion in the matter of whether a building has been brought down by controlled demolition or not. And with video documentation, all this can be proof of controlled demolition. A body of proof that we're going to apply now to the destruction of the Twin Towers to see what really happened there. Let's start at the beginning. Feature number 1, is there a sudden onset of destruction? And where is this? Is it at the bottom, like in normal controlled demolitions, at the base of the tower? No, this is at the point of jet plane impacts in this case. And this feature we looked at in part 2 of this 3-part series. We saw lots of that evidence of the sudden onset and the near free fall acceleration and without jolting or hesitation. We looked at patterned explosions and flashes of light heard and seen by hundreds of witnesses. So be sure to go back and look at this if you haven't seen it before. We saw a straight down or near straight down symmetrical progression of the destruction down the face of each building and a 1,400-foot diameter. with these lateral ejections of freely flying 4 and 8 ton structural steel sections. We looked at the near free fall acceleration of this building as it was coming down. It did not slow down at all when this theorized top portion of the building was said to have been driving the rest of the building down to the ground and then destroy itself. We took that myth apart. We also saw the total shattering of each of these towers down to their individual structural elements almost. We saw the lateral ejection of 4 and 8 ton structural steel sections weighing that much and ejected at 80 miles an hour laterally, landing 600 feet in all directions, trailed by thick white smoke clouds, which we're actually going to be looking at today. We saw the pulverized concrete of this building. We saw that the concrete was laid in like an ash, 100 micron particles, 2.3 square miles or 3 square miles around lower Manhattan. By the way, the steel being all outside the footprint, just about like 99.9% of it, and the concrete outside the footprint of the building, that those two major structural building components could not possibly have contributed to the crushing of the building below because they are distributed so far outside the perimeter of the building. All this was direct evidence of destruction with explosives. And again, fire doesn't create these features, any of them, let alone all of them. So we're moving on today to features 8, 9, and 10 in part 3 of this series. Let's look at the pyroclastic-like clouds, because the National Fire Protection Association, the Guide 921 for fire investigation of fire and explosions, says look for thermal effects. Yes, the large volumes of gas and the large amount of heat released in chemical explosions causing rapidly expanding plumes of hot gases, expanding, in this case, in the Twin Towers, 10 times the volume of the building in just 30 seconds. And that expansion is everywhere, and it takes incredible heat, which we'll be looking for the source of today, to expand these clouds of pyroclastic-like materials, pulverized concrete and other building materials. So it just completely covers lower Manhattan. In fact, well, can that heat be explained by these fires, which are diminished at the time of the collapse in these? No. We're looking for something much greater in terms of heat quantity that can be accomplished for this. So let's get right into it. The molten steel and iron as well, we're going to be looking at here as we start with Massimo Mazzucco's 9/11 New Pearl Harbor.
Possibly the most important unexplained phenomenon at Ground Zero are the extremely high temperatures registered under the rubble for many weeks after the collapses. On September 16, NASA shot these thermographic images of Ground Zero, indicating unusually high temperatures at the base of the 3 collapsed buildings. Despite the heavy rains of September 14th, the hotspots registered peak temperatures of more than 1,300 degrees under the rubble. 10 days later, the fires kept burning.
What's to explain, Governor, the smoke that still comes out?
There's still fire down below. There is such an incredibly deep pile of rubble, and then the tower goes down 5-6 stories underground.
But we had ABC crews come back just in the last few minutes and telling us there are still flames coming out of the base of the trade towers.
For the rescue workers, this became an additional burden on their already gruesome task.
Out still on the rubble, it's still, I believe, 1,100 degrees. The guy's boots just melt within a few hours.
On October 8th, the hotspots under the 3 collapsed buildings remained clearly visible. 6 weeks later, as the excavations progressed, the situation seemed only to get worse.
Oh, it's unbelievable. And this is 6 weeks later, almost 6 weeks later. And as we get closer to the center of this, it gets hotter and hotter. It's probably 1,500 degrees. We've had some small windows into what we thought was a core at some point, and it looked like an oven. You know, it was just roaring inside. It was just a bright reddish orange color.
The consequences of such extreme temperatures were quite visible on the steel that was being extracted from the rubble.
The grapplers were pulling stuff out, big sections of iron that were literally on fire on the other end. They would hit the air and burst into flames, which was pretty spooky to see.
You would create an air pocket by moving steel, fueling the fires underground. But, you know, these underground fires were just like the fires of hell.
If you could make a video of what you perceive hell to look like, from fire shooting up at times, that's what would happen. You would be in the middle of what would look like steel, and then fire just would pop up. Firemen were coming out with, and ironworkers with their boots literally melted. And then the hose would come over and they would try to put that part out.
I got there.
Charlie Vichers was a supervisor of removal operations at Ground Zero. From PBS's America Rebuilds page, we read, Vichers' crew picked up 40 to 60 foot long pieces of steel impaled in the pile, where the bottom 20 feet would be glowing red hot. Vichers said, trucks loaded with steel would pass by and you could feel the back of your neck burning standing 20 feet away. In an article called A Dangerous Worksite, the U.S. Department of Labor wrote, underground fires burned at temperatures of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. This was confirmed by Mayor Giuliani.
There were fires of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit below the ground.
The Journal of the American Society of Safety Engineers wrote, thermal measurements taken by helicopter each day showed underground temperatures ranging from 400 to more than 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit. 8 weeks later, and the fires still had not subsided.
You see how this debris is still smoking? That's when the fire is going to still burning. 8 weeks later, we still got fires burning. So, I mean, these things are burning. At one point, I think they were about 2,800 degrees.
11 weeks later, and the fires kept burning.
As recently as the end of November, it was still 1,100 degrees down underneath the rubble.
As November turned into December, ice was noticed in the mornings above the ground, but the debris underneath was still smoldering.
The weird thing was it was very cold when we were up there. I believe it was in the middle of the winter, but the ground wasn't frozen. The ground kind of like bubbled underneath your feet, which was kind of strange to me.
It took until December 19, more than 3 months after the collapses, for the last underground fire to be extinguished.
Well, let's look at some of these testimonies from these first responders and structural engineers like this one, David Scott from Arup Associates. I remember seeing red hot steel being pulled from deep within the pile. It was dripping from the molten steel, says this firefighter. Saw pools of literally molten steel at the World Trade Center. Now, jet fuel fires and office fires don't melt steel, right? We'll get into that. Seeing the molten steel, uncovering red hot metal beams, ranging from molten metal, which was still red hot weeks after the event. Molten steel at the heart of the tower's remains. Streams of molten metal that leaked down from the hot cores and flowed down. Metal dripping from a beam. Molten steel beams. The end of the beam would be dripping with molten steel. Mark Loiseau of Controlled Demolition, Inc. at the site says the molten steel was encountered primarily during excavation of debris. There are both videotape and photos of the molten steel being dipped out by the buckets of the excavators. And who says this? A little river of steel flowing. The very structural engineer who designed the World Trade Center Twin Towers himself are these credible witnesses. And his associate, Richard Garlock, the debris past the columns was red hot, molten, running. Like this material pouring out of the South Tower minutes prior to its collapse. Either molten steel or molten iron. NIST claims it's actually, NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who was tasked by Congress to explain the collapses of these three buildings. They say, well, this must have been molten airplane. Well, molten aluminum is silvery in daylight conditions. It doesn't glow bright yellow like you saw there and like you see here. from this falling liquid metal pouring out of the material held in the hands of this crab claw excavator. Well, at the Police Museum in New York, near Ground Zero, they have a section, an exhibit of molten concrete. I didn't even know concrete could melt. Fire temperatures so intense, it says, that concrete melted like lava around everything in its path. We're talking more than 3,000 degrees to melt concrete. And the author of the FEMA report himself, Jonathan Barnett, says steel members in the debris pile that appear to have been partly evaporated. Now, it takes 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit to evaporate steel. So this is documented by the New York Times that there's a problem here, a real problem. We don't have a quarter of those temperatures able to accomplish this in the World Trade Center. This structural engineer, Abolhassan Astani, also says he saw melting of girders in the World Trade Center. If you remember the Salvador Dali paintings with the clocks that are kind of melted, it's kind of like that. It can only happen if you get steel yellow hot or white hot, perhaps around 2,000 degrees. Well, let's go back to Massimo Mazzucco and see what else happened to this steel.
Another proof of extremely high temperatures reached during the collapse are the twisted and mangled steel beams found at Ground Zero.
Architects, engineers, people who work with steel, welders have just never seen the level of destruction and the level of deformation of this material in our lives.
You saw steel, some of the thickest steel I've ever seen, bent like a pretzel.
This 8-ton steel I-beam is 6 inches thick. It was selected to be preserved for future generations for the near-perfect horseshoe-like bend formed during the collapse.
I found it hard to believe that it actually bent because of the size of it and how there's no cracks in the iron. It bent without almost a single crack in it. It takes thousands of degrees to bend steel like this.
In fact, the temperature of 2,800 degrees mentioned before is not casual at all, as that's exactly the temperature at which steel melts.
And regarding the steel melting, we have FEMA, who did the original report that came out in 2002, May, with an Appendix C, which is a metallurgical examination of this unique phenomena in the steel. They say a 1-inch column from the Twin Towers has been reduced to 1/2-inch thickness, its edges curled like a paper scroll, thinned to almost razor sharpness. This is extraordinary because fires can't do this to steel, that is, office fires. Rapid oxidation, sulfidation, intergranular melting, liquid iron, that's molten iron, sulfur formed during this hot corrosion attack on the steel. So where does the sulfur come from? This is no clear explanation for the sulfur's been identified. We'll be looking for a clear explanation, and we're going to find it today. Perhaps the deepest mystery uncovered in the investigation, this attack on the steel, says the New York Times, and yet it is completely ignored by NIST and omitted from the final NIST report. They had this Appendix C in the FEMA report, but they omitted it. What are they trying to accomplish here? Where did the sulfur come from? Well, NIST says, well, sulfur is present in gypsum wallboard. No, it's not. That's calcium sulfate. And besides, gypsum wallboard has been used for 100 years to protect steel. It's never turned around and attacked the steel that it's designed to protect. And you can do experiments if you're wondering about this, just like John Cole did in Florida. A civil engineer, he made a 2,000 degree fire. He tried darn near to get it that hot with lots of gypsum wallboard against the steel. Was there any hot sulfur corrosion attack on his steel afterward? No, clean as a whistle. Yet the smell of sulfur permeated the World Trade Center, says John Field. It burned the smell of sulfur, this demolition worker at the site. And what does NIST, John Gross, the co-project leader of the NIST report, have to say about all this phenomena?
First of all, let's go back to your basic premise that there was a pool of molten steel. I know of absolutely nobody, and no eyewitness who said so, nobody who's produced it.
But witnesses testify otherwise.
You'd get down below and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails. Like you're in a foundry. Like lava.
Actually melted beams where it was molten steel that was being dug out.
Underground, it was still so hot that molten metal dripped down the sides of a wall.
And the cleanup was very difficult in the beginning. Steel was coming out red in certain areas from the first couple of weeks.
This fused element of steel, molten steel.
A river of steel flowing? Well, he denies this evidence, but his shadow is all over the evidence. Here he is found, John Gross, on the pile, finding the very piece of steel that was given to FEMA for their metallurgical examination in the Appendix C of their 2002 Building Performance Assessment Report. Well, what can create these temperatures? Maybe jet fuel. Let's look at that. Jet fuel is a hydrocarbon. Doesn't burn any hotter than desks or chairs. And even that is to say, in open air, according to its manufacturer, in open air, it only burns about 600 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 4 times less than is required to melt steel or so. But steel had definitely melted here. As you can see, the physics of these molten metals, is that you can tell the temperature by the color. Here we have bright yellow and even white hot temperatures exceeding 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. So what caused it to melt? Well, NIST has an answer to this in their set of very frequently asked questions, which they finally published on their website years later, after all of these questions they couldn't deny them anymore. They said, any molten steel in the wreckage was more likely due to the high temperature resulting from long exposure to combustion within the pile than to short exposure to fires or explosions while the buildings were standing. Well, wait a minute. There's a law. It's called the conservation of energy. In a closed system, like pulverized concrete powder covering these burning fires, the amount of energy is fixed. You can't create any more energy inside the system. I mean, the fire can't somehow get hotter than the capacity of the fuel that is burning. You can only convert that energy you have from one form to another. In other words, the heat is dissipated, not increased. This is one of the hundreds of examples of fraud that we've been showing you and will continue to show you today in this seminar. Let's go to feature number 10. Is there evidence of what could create this incredible heat? Could thermite have created it in the resulting molten metal? Well, what is thermite anyway?
An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results.
Well, wait a minute. Maybe we're getting somewhere here, because if thermite were used, it would explain the elemental iron. We haven't used iron in our skyscrapers for 100 years or so. It would also explain the presence of sulfur, because sulfur is added to thermite to become thermate, much more effective at cutting through steel. It would also explain the incredible heat. We're creating 4,000 degree temperatures here. Well, the National Fire Protection Guide 921 says look for unusual residues that could arise from thermite or other pyrotechnic materials. Now, this is extraordinary because NIST was involved in creating these guides for the National Fire Protection Association. They should have known to follow them. What did they say? They found no corroborating evidence to suggest that explosives were used. Okay, did you look? No. A year later, when pressed, they finally admit in writing, NIST did not test for the presence of explosive residue. You can't find what you won't look for. But others did. Stephen Jones, former nuclear physicist, formerly from Brigham Young University, finds that thermite would produce a characteristic burn pattern, a white, yellow, hot liquid metal, which we see pouring out of the South Tower, for instance, 10 minutes prior to its collapse. He says you'd also see a whitish cloud of aluminum oxide ash, which we see rising off the top of this pouring liquid out of the hot molten liquid pouring out of the South Tower. And like we see trailing these freely flying structural steel sections ejected laterally out of the towers at 80 miles an hour. Wait a minute. Back to, forward to. Steel is not flammable under conditions of office fires. What's going on at the ends of these steel beams such that they're trailing these thick white smoke clouds? Looks more like a volcanic eruption in the Tongan Sea in 2009. Freely flying structural solid objects in a geometry of fireworks trailing thick white smoke clouds. Both of the Twin Towers appear identical in this respect in terms of their destruction. Regarding these beams on fire, let's listen to this firefighter once again.
The grapplers were pulling stuff out, big sections of iron that were literally on fire on the other end. They would hit the air and burst into flames.
They hit the air and burst into flames and leave you. And the signature of thermite would leave behind unique chemical evidence, Dr. Jones says. Common elements such as iron, aluminum, copper, calcium, silicon, but more unusual elements also like fluorine and manganese left behind in the residue. These elements in the periodic table of the elements. Well, somebody sent him a piece of this 40-pound chunk of previously molten metal. They called them meteorites. They were all over the place, this fused molten metal and concrete that you've already heard about. Well, he's got a small chip and he does electron microprobe data, finding that it's predominantly iron. So he can rule out molten aluminum from the jet planes. It has abundant manganese, so he can rule out structural steel as a major component. So what is it? Well, it has aluminum, sulfur, potassium. He's found the residue of thermite, an incendiary. And he finds manganese and fluorine in abundance in this material. Well, where would that come from? Manganese is from the potassium permanganate, commonly used as an oxidizer in thermite. Fluorine is used in special thermite charges called sol gels. So these are often present and are the result or a part of a thermite fingerprint. It's very clear, he determines, But interestingly enough, sol gels would leave another residue, 1,3-diphenyl propane. What the heck is that? The EPA finds one molecule at levels that dwarfed all others. 1,3-diphenyl propane. We've never observed it in any other sampling we've ever done, says the EPA. In other words, it's not a result of office fires. It's not plastics, which they were speculating here. Somebody else sent him some slag from the ends of this beam, which was a sculptor sent him this for work he was doing in the Manitoba International Peace Park. So he does X-ray fluorescence analysis and finds what? Iron, sulfur, potassium, manganese, the ingredients of thermite residue in its ignited, post-ignited form. So that's absolutely critical and interesting and corroborative. You can make thermite in your own backyard. John Cole, civil engineer, did it. You use a shaped cutter charge to force this molten iron through into the beam, cutting it.
Web was reduced in thickness with gaping holes, thinned to almost razor sharpness, with a Swiss cheese appearance.
Wait a minute. Where did we see that Swiss cheese appearance and razor sharpness before? Oh, yeah, in the Appendix C metallurgical examination by FEMA, which NIST threw out when they took over the investigation in 2004. Well, there are much more effective devices that use thermite to cut through much thicker sections of structural steel. And they were patented prior to 9/11. Why would they use thermite? Well, here's one possible answer. There are devices whose casings themselves are manufactured from consolidated consumable thermite. There's nothing left behind in the residue except pools of molten iron, which were documented all over the place and denied by NIST. Why wouldn't they have used high energy explosives like C4 or RDX? Well, those would provide loud bangs and very bright flashes, audio and visual signatures that you might not want to have in a deceptive, controlled demolition. So you have to go to some other technology, which has its own set of evidence, which we're continuing to dive into here as we look at the fine powder, so ubiquitous, 3 square miles across lower Manhattan, pulverized concrete. This is where we found the concrete in last week's part 2 of this series, completely distributed outside the World Trade Center towers. Well, the U.S. Geological Survey does their detailed analysis of the dust in 2005. They publish that there are billions of previously molten iron microspheres. So once again, we have the iron, we have the molten, and now we have spheres. Well, where these spheres are almost naked to the human eye in size. Some of them are up to a 1/16 of an inch large. They're in all the World Trade Center dust samples. In fact, up to 6% of some of these samples are these previously molten iron microspheres. By extrapolation, it amounts to about 4 tons. That's 150 times the value of the quantity in common office building dust, which does not have spheres, but it has iron particles that are not spherical. But here we have spheres. Well, how do they get formed? Well, R.J. Lee Group in their documentation, they're a forensic international environmental consulting firm. They say they're formed during the World Trade Center event, not before by the ironworkers, not afterward by the iron workers that are taking the building apart, but during the event itself. And they're so ubiquitous and everywhere and such a mystery that they use it to distinguish World Trade Center dust from common office building dust. In other words, it's not even World Trade Center dust unless it has all these previously molten iron microspheres that they can't calculate how they came into being. They don't even guess. Well, how could they come into being? In a thermite controlled experiment like this one, you have a very small sample of thermite producing thousands of what? Molten iron microspheres, which cool and fall into the pan in this case. Why? Well, aerosolized liquids produce spherically shaped droplets by their surface tension. That's just what they do. That's what raindrops are. So that under explosive conditions with a thermite style controlled demolition, you'd aerosolize that liquid molten thermite, and that would cool and fall, and not so cool because it seems to be toasting the tops of these cars around the World Trade Center. What other rational explanation is there for the toasting of the tops of these cars in the World Trade Center in this high heat event? Well, what else did they find in the World Trade Center dust? A team of 8 international scientists led by Niels Harrit in Copenhagen was given 7 independently collected samples, like the one from this apartment by Jeanette McKinley, who all these apartments across from the South Tower on Liberty Street were trashed as explosions blew in their windows and all this dust filled their apartments. Well, she was a sculptor, an artist, and she used this material in her artwork to help her healing. Well, these samples were collected and analyzed. They find in all of them these curious red-gray chips, red on one side, gray on the other. The largest is about a 1/16 of an inch in size or long. And they thought they were paint, of course, but they're attracted by a magnet. So they have a very high iron content. They get real curious and do analysis on the red layer, X-ray energy dispersive spectroscopy, and find what? The ingredients of thermite, iron, and aluminum. What's that doing there? The ingredients of thermite in all of these chips, which are in all of the World Trade Center dust samples. They get real curious, zoom into that red layer 50,000 times with a nuclear microscope, and they find what? Nanoscale particles of iron oxide rhomboidal shaped crystals and aluminum platelets. Again, the ingredients of thermite, set in a bed of oxygen, silica, carbon. This organic material is what provides the expansion in high energy explosives like C4 and RDX. So they appear to have engineered at the nano scale, very incredible technology, an incendiary, which works by means of heat, to become more explosive. In fact, the peer-reviewed literature on super thermite, which is what this is, has been published by Lawrence Livermore Lab and others. And when they take these, ignite this nanothermite material at about 758 degrees Fahrenheit, it ignites. And that's exactly what all 4 of the chips did, mimicking the peer-reviewed literature in the differential scanning calorimeter. But what happens when they ignite? They produce molten iron microspheres with the same chemical signature as that of the molten iron microspheres found in all the World Trade Center dust. So you see, we know where these molten iron microspheres came from because they're found attached to partially ignited red-gray chips, as you see here and here. So you see, we have an internally consistent, self-corroborating set of repeatable experimental data that can be used in a court of law to bring to justice the real perpetrators of 9/11. This is extremely high-tech stuff because of its surface volume, or its incredible small size of these particles. The surface volume increases exponentially. So you have almost instantaneous chemical reactions or more explosive materials. See, this is not made in a cave in Afghanistan. This is made only in the most advanced defense contracting laboratories. So this team of 8 scientists published this 25-page paper in the Bentham Open Chemical Physics Journal. It stands uncontested. Nobody has submitted since 2009 another paper refuting the results of this work. This is one of the many, many, many smoking guns that we've been talking about in this 3-part series. Today, direct evidence of destruction with explosives. Fire doesn't create these features, any of them, let alone all of them. And these are very unconventional features of controlled demolition, as we've been seeing with the incendiary evidence today. Especially these fires can't be responsible for all of that incredible heat. We even have the thermal imaging videos from the Cumulus release from the Freedom of Information Act request. These came out showing temperatures not even exceeding 300 degrees. NIST somehow claims 1800 degrees without any evidence to support that Fahrenheit. So what do the experts say? One of 100 of these structural engineers among the 3,000 architects and engineers is Ronald Brookman, who says it doesn't look anything like a heat-induced gravitational collapse mechanism. Why did the complete collapse of the Twin Towers become inevitable, as NIST claims? Why would all 110 stories drop straight to the ground in 10 seconds, pulverizing the contents to dust and twisted steel? Makes no sense to him. Fire protection engineer Ed Munyak. The fires were very weak. NIST reports and confirms that the steel temperatures were low. Their own metallurgical paint analysis confirms that temperatures were no higher than 600 degrees Fahrenheit. World Trade Center collapses have no resemblance to any previous high-rise fire collapse. Well, what about the evidence? Surely in the most puzzling failures and the largest in human history, we would have preserved this material for forensic examination. Well, let's listen to one of the structural engineers who was trying to do just that, Abul Hassan Astani Azal.
After 9/11, we realized that Port Authority of New York and New Jersey has sent all the steel that we need to study. That's why I'm here to study steel. Has sent all the steel to recycling plant to go to China for recycling. For what? For 15 cents a pound. Just nothing. And all the evidence of steel went to melting pot.
All the evidence of the steel went to the melting pot, to China, for recycling. And Mayor Bloomberg now says, or then said, shortly thereafter said, just looking at a piece of metal generally doesn't tell you anything. He's justifying the destruction of the steel. He's an engineer. Bill Manning, Fire Engineering Magazine editor-in-chief, cries out, crucial evidence that could answer many questions is on the slow boat to China, showing an astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately. But it didn't, of course. In fact, starting just 2 weeks after 9/11, the steel was put on barges, sent to China for recycling, and easily the largest and most perplexing structural failures in history. 400 truckloads a day. This is the illegal destruction of evidence in a crime scene, which is why we use the scientific method. And so what conclusions have you come to regarding the hypotheses that have been examined here? Which one merits turning into a provable theory? Planes and fires, or explosions and controlled demolition? What we've shown you today is the feature 8, 9, and 10 in part 3 of this series. Part 2 of this series, we showed you features 1 through 7. Altogether, direct evidence of destruction with explosives and fire doesn't create any of these features, let alone all of them. With additional circumstantial corroborative testimony we've looked at, we believe that this, and 3,000 architects and engineers also believe that this is evidence of a crime, the controlled demolition of the Twin Towers. A crime which we want you to answer, we want you to ask your questions about, and you can do that right here today. Andy, how do we do that?
Okay, please submit any questions that you might have in the input form we talked about before. That's at ae911truth.org, and just find continuing education and select the live webinars, and there's a box right there. And in the meantime, we're going to tell you about some of the ways that you can get involved if now that you're informed, you agree this evidence is quite compelling and warrants a new investigation.
Perfect. And while you're there, everybody, subscribe to our newsletter. It takes 2 seconds. Well, maybe 20 seconds. Put your name in there and your email. We'll get you the latest evidence we're collecting, the latest efforts we're making toward getting a real investigation. And get informed while you're there too. On our website, there's an excellent evidence section with additional documents and videos, etc., that you can use to inform yourself. I mean, there's lots of material there. And sign a petition also. Join the 3,000 architects and engineers, especially if you are one. But even if not, we have 20,000 others supporting them. And while you're there, please donate to our work. We have a 501c3 nonprofit organization, which will help you to get a tax deduction for supporting us. If you don't need that, we still need your support, because we're all over the country doing presentations, and we are making incredible efforts with our crew of 6 employees. And we need your support to do the incredible projects that I'm about to tell you about real quick before we get to those questions of yours. But you can donate right here. You can also join our planned giving program and support us that way with by putting us in your will, for instance. There's many different ways of doing planned giving. That's all on our website now. Now, become a member of AE911 Truth and give as little as a cup of coffee a month. If you think this issue is more important than 1 cup of coffee a month, we encourage you to join us. That's all it takes. There's thousands of us doing just that. And if you can give more, that's fantastic. That will keep us going and doing greater outreach activities. And volunteer with us too if you can't do any of that. We need your support, right, Andy?
Absolutely, and that is the best way to help out, is to roll up your sleeves and get involved. And we've got tons of things for people to do. There's always work to do, especially when you're taking on an issue like this. So if you just got a few hours a week of your time to donate, please do so. And we've got jobs for every type of personality out there, whether you like to talk to the public or whether or not you just want to keep to yourself. There's research that can be done, or if you got some kind of skill maybe doesn't fit into anything that we've laid out so far, but you'd be bringing a new perspective to the table. Please fill out that form. You do that by going to ae911truth.org. Very short application form, and within the week we'll get in touch with you and see where you'll best fit in. So please consider doing that.
Absolutely, and thank you, because there's things you can do on your own as well. Reach out to your elected representatives. In fact, make an appointment. We'll give the presentation for you on the phone with your elected representative. Tell them about the Halsey report, which we talked about in part 1 of this series, Alaska Finite Element Analysis, 4-year study from one of the top forensic structural engineers in the country. I'll tell you about him. But television, radio, newspaper, tell everybody you know. Screen the DVDs that we have in our store to your friends and colleagues. Give them a brochure. We have this brochure, for instance. We have you can get 100 of them for $10, and you can give them out. They have all the evidence in there. Well, as much as we could cram in there, and download the finite element analysis and send it to them. So we have this finite element analysis is done by Professor Leroy Halsey from University of Alaska at Fairbanks, and he is disproven the every bit of the official NIST report. And we went through that in part 1 of this series, but basically he concluded that fire didn't cause the collapse of Building 7. It didn't experience a progressive collapse. It was actually a global collapse caused by the near simultaneous failure of all the columns. What does that? Well, we've gotten 75,000 postcards, thanks to you who support us, out to and we're on our way to getting every engineer in the country aware of the report. And so we also have an inquest petition in the UK because Jeff Campbell was murdered on the 106th floor of the North Tower, and his family is saying, no, we've got proof of controlled demolition here. We want to get a new inquest into his death. And we've raised the funds necessary to do just that. And next week, we will be submitting that. So we're very excited about that. You should also know that 5 New York area city fire commissioners from Franklin Square and Munson joined together in unanimous support of a resolution demanding a new investigation into the destruction of these skyscrapers. So we have also a correction to NIST, which is saying you can't produce fraudulent reports. We've proven here 6 ways from Sunday that your Building 7 report is fraudulent. So we've taken that best evidence for Building 7 and we have submitted it. And we're in an appeal process right now because they wrote back and said, oh, yeah, we think we did a good job. And they basically didn't even address any of our concerns specifically. But Andy, how do people make that phone call with their congressional representatives?
Well, the simple answer is just pick up the phone and give them a call. You know, I learned that they keep a tally of all the issues that they hear about, and they see how many people are talking about it. And if it's enough people, they got to come up with some kind of a response. And that is why you do have to get involved. Richard just mentioned the request for correction. We were involving members of Congress in watching that issue, and we're going to continue to do that, especially with a new congressional class coming in January. We're actually going to be sending them a letter saying, hey, congratulations for winning. Now you've got to tackle this issue. We're going to keep on doing this. So the best way to get involved is first go to ae911truth.org/justice. There you'll learn about the Bobby McIlvaine Act. That is draft legislation that was written for exactly what we've been calling for a number of years, a new investigation into the destruction of these towers for the nearly 3,000 people who died on that day. And it's named after Bobby McIlvaine, who was killed by an explosion in the North Tower lobby that morning. His father has worked with us for a number of years, and it's a great conversation starter talking about Bobby when you talk to your representatives. It's hard to ignore it. It's draft legislation for the new investigation, and would select or create a select committee that can be passed in either house to look into this evidence and exactly look into the hypothesis of controlled demolition, so they can't just drag some NIST representatives out there to give them some talking points and dismiss it. But as I say every week, because it's so true, members of Congress don't do something unless they have a lot of pressure from their constituents, because their main job is to get elected. So they need to hear from you. So pick up your phone. If you're locked down right now and you got nothing to do, pick up the phone, call your members of Congress, tell them that they need to get behind the Bobby McIlvaine Act, that they need to keep an eye on this request for correction that AE is pursuing with NIST, and that they need to speak out, because this is the most important issue, even 20 years later. It's still affecting our world to this day. So please get involved. And if you need materials to help you out, go to ae911truth.org/justice. You can print out a copy of the act. You can actually fill in your address too. It will generate an email to your members of Congress if you don't have time to write one out. So there's so many ways to get involved. There's no excuse not to.
Nope. And that reminds me, Andy, we have a brand new film out. It's called 7. It's about the study itself, the World Trade Center 7 study by the University of Alaska. It is out. It's not on YouTube, but you can go to our website, ae911truth.org, and find out how you can watch it on either Amazon Prime, iTunes, Vudu, Hulu, and hope to get it up on Netflix also. So watch it and give us a review of it. Give your review. Now, we've also submitted 57, now 60 exhibits of the evidence you've seen in this 3-part series to the U.S. Attorney in Manhattan. He has written back saying he will comply with the law requiring him to give this to a special grand jury. We don't have proof that he did. And he's not there anymore. There's a stand-in for him. And so we're expecting results from our mandamus action, which forces him to prove what he's done there. We've also sued the FBI because they have our evidence, and we have very good proof of that. And they were supposed to give it to Congress in the 2015 9/11 Commission review, and they didn't. That would have made it public. And when they do, by this lawsuit, get forced to turn that over, it will be public as well. So that's exciting. Stand by. We're in a legal going back and forth regarding that lawsuit. And that the essence of the evidence in those cases is laid out here in a documentary, 9/11 Explosive Evidence Experts Speak Out, in which we've assembled 40 high-rise architects, structural engineers, metallurgists, chemists, physicists, controlled demolition experts, all laying out this evidence so that it just can't even be denied anymore. I wanted to give you a taste of this. Here's just a couple of minutes. What are you doing barking like that? Don't bark. Dogs aren't supposed to bark.
I don't want to be involved in conspiracy theories. There are lots of them. They can go on. We can speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how those buildings came down.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
To undermine scientific integrity is to undermine our democracy.
This is what NIST has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence.
The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed the petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, was not valid science.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to the descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
Dus dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten.
What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
NIST excluded the documents from FEMA in Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
There were these iron microspheres present in all of the dust samples. They needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
All the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved.
In the dust, what we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
And in fact, the evidence is overwhelming that these red-gray crystals are very high-temperature incendiaries.
And we have watched as scientific integrity has been undermined and scientific research politicized in an effort to advance predetermined ideological agendas.
If this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime. Evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. When the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
Oh, Richard, you're still muted.
Good catch, Andy. Thank you. Appreciate that. You can get this video on, you can watch it free on YouTube, or you can watch the extended version on on the DVD in our store, which has the extended interviews, like 40 of them, like 20 minutes each average. Great information. I got to watch that again myself. It's been a couple of years. And then the psychologists also explain, like 5 or 6 of them with lots of examples, why this information is so difficult and how to get through to people as well. Our landmark booklet, 50 pages, just dissecting the NIST report and their effort, and adding all the evidence, is available for you to download for free from beyondmisinformation.org. You can also buy the coffee table version and give it to VIPs. It's only $10. It's really nicely made. Our classic lecture on this series, 9/11 Blueprint for Truth, you can see free on YouTube now. And as you can, our first edition of our Building 7, a documentary, only 15 minutes, narrated by Ed Asner. That's free on YouTube, and you can get the DVDs and hand them out as well. Hey, let's get to those questions, though. Don't we have some, Andy?
Yes, we have 3 today, and this first one's a really good one. It's also a long one. So it says, I believe the NIST official story that claims the sagging floor trusses caused the Twin Towers to collapse is wrong, and here's why. Shouldn't the North Tower floor trusses have sagged sooner than the floor trusses in the South Tower? After all, the fires in the North Tower had a 17-minute head start, plus the fires in the North Tower were much higher. where the perimeter column steel was thinner. And to me, the thinner steel columns should have been easier to pull inwards than in the South Tower's thicker steel columns. Any questions?
That's going to be
any comments.
Oh, sorry, Andy. What?
No, I wanted to correct. Any comments is what he wrote.
Any questions? Right. That's going to be difficult for anybody to prove that one tower versus the other should have had this or that. The fires were are just simply not easily measurable. You have to do tests like we showed you today, and when they do those tests, they show that the nature of the structural steel form is robust. That's from the executive summary of those fire tests in Cardington in 1995. They find that steel frame structures are incredibly resistant to fire, even when they're not fireproofed. The problem at the Twin Towers is you have lightweight steel trusses, and you have at least the claim by NIST that the airplane knocked off the cementitious fireproofing. So you can't prove that one way or another. The way they tried to prove it is to shoot a shotgun at cementitious fireproofing, and some of it did blow off, not much. It's just not scientific whatsoever what they did, and this question is not going to yield us the greatest results in terms of impacting the minds of lay and professionals alike. The exhibition of the actual evidence for controlled demolition is 100 times more powerful than saying what fires could or couldn't have done, especially in one tower versus the other. Andy, you might have some additional thoughts there.
I really don't. I think you pretty much covered it in terms of what would be something that would appeal and catch the public's attention and what you could measure here. So no, I have nothing to add. Our next question says, are there any elements in the building that could have been responsible for the red gray chips in the dust?
No, there aren't. And here's what we hear from stupid people and people with ulterior motives. And I mean officials like NIST. Well, there was aluminum panels on the towers, and there was rust, which is iron oxide, the two ingredients of thermite there, on the beams. And so it's possible that during the collapse of this building, these elemental materials could have somehow combined into super thermite. And that's why I say stupid people and people with ulterior motives, because only an idiot or an agent of the perpetrators of this crime would come to such conclusions and try to lead very innocent and critically unthoughtful people to conclusions which make no sense. Andy, you have a thought on that too?
I've heard people try to claim that the red gray chips are primer paint. I think the best debunking of that, you can actually find the video with a little bit of searching. Things are getting a little more censored now on YouTube. But Mark Basil did a ignition test. I believe it was him who did it, where he ignited one of the red gray chips, and of course they ignited the paint chips. And you can see a side-by-side comparison of what actually happens. When the paint chips get ignited, it turns black and kind of crinkles up like a leaf. When one of these red gray chips is ignited, it actually has a thermite reaction. There's an ignition, and then it forms one of the spheres, the metallic spheres here that have been found all throughout the World Trade Center dust. The iron microspheres is what I'm trying to say. So no, I mean the results are completely different, and if NIST was actually scientific, they would have seen that, but I don't think they even acknowledge any of this. So that's all I have to say on it.
Right.
How does NIST explain the Swiss cheese steel in the FEMA report and the 4,000 degree temperatures that would have been needed to make that happen?
NIST ignores the Appendix C metallurgical examination in the 2002 FEMA report. They do not try to explain the hot temperature sulfur attack on the steel, which is very clearly documented by those scientists. So they take the report and they throw it out. There's nothing they can do with it, or any of this other evidence, the 200 plus witnesses of explosions, for instance. They throw that out and say there were no explosions outside the explosion of jet fuel and maybe some explosive jet fuel in the lobby. They really don't deal with it. And as they don't deal with 3/4, maybe 7/8 of our evidence, and then the rest of it, they have some sort of a lame explanation for that we've been looking at throughout the webinar here. You have any thoughts on that one?
Right. Well, I believe NIST had a predetermined conclusion, and then they just molded all their tests and the evidence that they chose to look at to try to meet it. And they ignored a bunch of observable facts. One of them was this right from the FEMA report. I mean, there's a picture, I believe you showed it earlier in this webinar, of John Gross himself standing next to some of the Swiss cheese steel that was found. And of course, as most of this audience knows, NIST refused to test the dust samples for explosives, and their logic for it when they were pressed on it was that, well, we don't expect to find it, so we didn't test for it. So that's circular reasoning. That is not science, and it's all because there was a predetermined conclusion. And that is, of course, what the whole purpose of the NIST investigation was, which is why we need a new one, simply put. That's right. Well, thank you, Andy. And I think that's our last question, I guess, is it? Yes, it is. Okay, so let's look and see what we did today. We looked at part 3 of the World Trade Center destruction, 9/11 An Architect's Guide, and with extreme heat, looking at the high-rise fires themselves, the pyroclastic-like clouds, the molten steel and iron evidence, iron microspheres, thermite, nanothermite. It's all there. It's conclusive forensic scientific proof of the destruction of these towers by incendiaries. So what are you going to do with that information? Send it out. The same link you used to watch today live is going to be the link. You can send this recording out. Send last week's part 2 of this series out as well. And then we start all over again in January with all 3 parts, consecutive Thursdays, 1 p.m., starting the first Thursday of the month. We hope that's 1 p.m. Pacific. We hope you'll join us again at that time. And I'd like to thank everybody and Andy for helping me. And we'll catch up with you in January. Thanks. Bye.